ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 286, and I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. And today we have a question from someone by the name of Logan Elder. I believe, we've had his questions before. He asks, back on episode 228, have you ever tried to use Fairbanks Morse diesels? And the answer isn't no, but only when they were the only option. And really it was the same thing with a lot of older diesels, Alcos, not really Baldwins because there really aren't many of them left. I'm not sure if we ever got one to run, but we used whatever was on hand when we started getting more diesel fuel. Before that, we generally avoided diesel engines, as I've talked about before, but Fairbanks Morse, being relatively scarce, didn't see a lot of runtime with the Zombie Train Incorporated. Generally, we would go for things that were simpler, so, older diesels would be useful, but the fact of the matter was there were more newer diesels around, like significantly more. So, going for newer stuff made a lot of sense because we could get spare parts more easily. And that, in the end, is really what it boiled down to. When we started doing our transition era, so to speak, it wasn't... The scrounging was pretty much over. The scrounging for materials and supplies had plagued the Zombie Train Incorporated from the very beginning. Of course, the Zombie Train itself, being more of a scavenger operation than anything, was... I wouldn't say the poster child, but was, it was a lot of that. The other thing, though, is when we started moving over, it was like, okay, we're done with that. We're moving past this era where we are trying to build our own engines, or restore old engines, or that sort of thing. We're done with the era where we are, basically constantly fighting to survive. And it felt like that would have been over beforehand, but on the whole, running the steam engines still, it felt like that wasn't the case. Because we always felt like we were at a loss, at a shortage, or that we were on the precipice of something, major or bad happening. So, yeah. So that was that. When we started bringing diesels out, it was very much okay, it's time to move on, it's time to move forward. And, there were thoughts of, well, we could engineer our own diesels because we're sort of working from the ground up here. We're not sure if we have the ability to do a lot of these things, but in general, we didn't know if we had the engineering tolerances and the technical expertise to work on newer diesels, but on the whole, things were already laid out for them, and things were, thus fairly laid out for us to be able to do that work. And it's not like there were too many instruction manuals out there, but with the diesels that we were looking at using, having been produced fairly recently, or even currently as of the Great Panic, it became sort of not a no-brainer, but all of the information was there. It was all available. We didn't have to do a lot of scrounging. We didn't have to do very much, frantic cross-country searching. We would go to where they were being built, and we would figure it out. And at this point in time, we had a lot of resources, and a lot of manpower, and a lot of smart people. Some of whom were either mechanics that were with the Navy, or something like that, or just people that knew their way around engines. Unsurprisingly, we weren't the only people that survived the zombie apocalypse with the knowledge of how to work a locomotive, or how to build a locomotive. And we had employed a lot of these people beforehand, but before having the ability to use diesels properly again, we didn't really, we couldn't really exercise everything that they knew. So, it was like well, yeah, I know how you know how to work on a GEVO, but we're going to be putting you in charge of these 5 steam engines at this shop. I know it's a leap, but you're going to have to figure this one out. And, we didn't know everything. Naturally, I didn't know everything. I was young when the war started. I was in my teens. I can't even recall how old I was. It was 2012. So, that, I must have been 16? Yeah, I was 16 when the war started. And I didn't know that much. I sort of realized that I was like a jack of all trades, master of none when it came to locomotive knowledge. I didn't know very much. I knew enough to get the engine to move, but having to keep it running was something that we had to figure out sort of on the fly, on the go. And that was difficult. That was very difficult. It was a lot harder than I had initially thought, and there were things that cropped up that were more problematic than I had initially figured they would be, or things that I hadn't even considered. Certain maintenance issues that totally flew over my head that I wouldn't have even considered were an issue. Keeping things like the injectors working, or, the lubricators working, or the air pump, or, that sort of thing. These intricate mechanical pieces of the locomotive that, with my limited knowledge at 16 years old, to me they just sort of worked. And I hadn't really considered that, you really need to take them apart and clean them every once in a while, or, go get gummed up and stop, and this will be the consequence. There were a couple of times where we just, the brake pump either kept going and it wouldn't stop, it didn't reach its cutoff, and we ended up blowing a couple of hoses, or which those hoses admittedly were rotted anyway. It's not like we, pumped it up to crazy pressure, because the brake pump can only pump as much as the boiler is, but, I digress. It wouldn't stop. It got over the point that we would normally set brake pressure at, and then broke things. Or times where it wouldn't go, and we had no brake pressure, and thankfully those were times where we were starting, and not where we needed to stop. But, the fact of the matter is, there were definitely things that broke down on us on that locomotive, and on other locomotives, even later, that I didn't anticipate. I didn't know. I couldn't understand. I knew what a hot box was, but I didn't know how to fix one. Or even really how to identify one, other than, that's on fire. And, there's smoke coming out of that. That sort of thing. And there were some things that broke, and we just sort of gave up on. Like, that's broken now. We're just not going to use that, like the Stoker. The Stoker was gone by the time we were crossing the pass, pretty much. And that was it. That was the end of the Stoker until we got it patched back together, which was much later. And, sorry, I'm getting away from the question, but I'm not even sure how many Fairbanks Morse diesels existed before the war. There can't have been many, right? Because it's not like those weren't engines that were, out on main lines before the war. They were, in museums. And pulling a diesel out of a museum was something that we generally did not do. And the reason we did not do it is because there were plenty of diesels out there, not in museums. Plenty of diesels in major rail yards of CSX, NS, BNSF, UP, all the other Class 1s, or, well, the other 2 or 3, and the Class 2s, and we thought about it, and we figured that if we were ever going to need to build our own diesels, or we ever had problems with diesels, the only thing that we could do, or the smartest thing for us to do, was to go back to some earlier generation diesels, but ones that, the companies that supported them still existed, like old GPs and SDs, the simpler ones, that you could get parts for still fairly readily, but to make parts on your own for was not that difficult. The engineering tolerances were not high. They didn't take a lot of computer expertise. It's sort of like working on an older car, where things are just relatively simple, but they aren't primitive. And, that's what tossed around in our heads. We never really had to use that, though. We never had to look into that and go, okay, let's bring back some I don't know, SD9s or something, although those are first generation. Though they were still fairly reliable, railroads still used them. But for the most part, it was, okay, we've got all these, let's just see which ones work. And we did a lot of that, and we did a lot of figuring, like, okay, these guys work, we'll run those, we'll see if we can cannibalize parts to get more running ones. And that happened with a lot of, the later SDs or GPs, some GVOs, that sort of thing. These engines that were really fairly modern, but were still operable after a few years, well, few is lowballing it, but after some years of downtime, with a little bit of oil and TLC. Now, there were plenty of ones that did not survive, because of one reason or another. Generally, when you let an engine sit for that long, it's going to need some hefty work afterwards, but there were the lucky ones, the ones that could still go, and those were the ones that were really the godsend in the beginning of the transition era, where we realized that, wow, look at this. You really can devote many, many more manpower hours to driving as opposed to being in the shop for a given locomotive with a diesel. And even though we ran our steam engines ragged, seeing that transition, it was a no-brainer. As much as I didn't want to, because of course I am and always have been a steam fanatic. But seeing that and realizing, oh, this is the way it is. This is the way things are. This is why they changed over in the first place from steam to diesels. And now that we have a decent supply line, we are so golden that I don't even need to, consider the steam issue. We don't need to worry about building more steam engines. We need to worry about fixing the diesels now that we have fuel for them. And as a side note, we started selling this fuel to the Navy, which they were operating mostly on either reserves or nuclear-powered ships, of which there were a handful, mostly carriers. But they were operating a lot of nuclear-powered ships because they didn't need fuel for them. And then they could finally bring a lot of the fleet back into life. And we started also bartering for gasoline, because when you refine crude oil, you get everything. You get everything from airplane fuel to bunker C, and you can use that for all sorts of stuff. And there were some engines that we were like, oh, these engines ran on diesel before the war, why don't we just, or, they ran on bunker C or something like that before the war, why don't we just do that? And there were, some instances where we did do that, but it was only a couple of engines, and it was ones that had been, in the spotlight before the war, ones that we knew we could get to operate pretty easily on that kind of fuel, 4449 and 844, these engines that were famous, and now we could convert them back to running on oil, which was a painstaking process, because we had gone through the pains of converting them to run coal, even in some cases these engines that had never run on coal. And none of our new build engines were designed to run on fuel oil or bunker C or anything like that, or diesel, I suppose, is what I was meaning to say, or bunker C, because bunker C is fuel oil, I think. Or is that heating oil? Whatever. It's a kind of oil. It's low-grade stuff. And we didn't convert any of those, because why would we? And then that was that. We moved into the modern era again. We were finally back in the 2000s as opposed to the 1940s. It was a big deal to be able to make that transition, but it was largely on the backs of much more modern and, more contemporary contemporarily ubiquitous engines. Ones that you'd see out and about before the Great War, or not the Great War, World War Z. And not on the backs of museum pieces. For once, it was nice to be able to have something that you could really, really rely on. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, post them down below, and I will see you guys next week. Trainman out.